the challenge, the opportunity to connect. The 1960s, a time of imagination and change, a time of anger and fear. The 1960s, a program called Challenge.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Looked at our connections, our divisions, through the lens of faith. Nearly 60 years later, during these challenging times, we'll take a new look at our divisions, our connections, in a new program called Challenge 2.0. They were everyday activities we take for granted, stopping at a gas station, pausing for prayer, traveling home. Yet each turned tragic, in some cases, life-ending. None were the result of simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Each was the result of aggression. Each person was targeted because they seemed different. Yet each tragedy led to transformation. That is the focus of this episode of Challenge 2.0, from rage to reconciliation, from tragedy to transformation. So we're very fortunate to have three wonderful guest panelists for this program. I'd like to introduce them. First, Rais Buiyan's life path, which led from Bangladesh to the United States, from a career as an Air Force pilot to an information technology expert to president and founder of the organization World Without Hate. The backstory of this journey, if you will, is startling, I believe, to the point of unbelievability. But the reality of your story is true and inspiring, and it serves as an icon of reconciliation and transformation. Thank you so much for being with us, Rais.
It's glad to be here.
The phrase hate crime, on its surface, I think is a very sterile term. It offers little sense of the violence, the pain, and the struggle to make sense out of what is, after all, senseless. Those challenges may seem to, on their surface, to have defined the life of Theresa Crecelius for the last 2 years, but Theresa and her story expands our sense of how faith and human spirit can transcend tragedy. She and her sense of purpose offer a gift to everyone who encounters you, and thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Jeff.
Arjun Sethi is familiar with hate and has sought to make us familiar with the experience because of what we can learn from it, and also the trauma of hate crimes. You've also worked a great deal not only with that experience and the willingness to share it as a gift and what it holds for each of us as a gift. A Sikh, a community activist, and an attorney who teaches law at both Georgetown and Vanderbilt universities, Arjun has written the book, and you brought it with you, American Hate. He's here to share his depth of understanding, his knowledge, and his perspectives. Arjun, thank you so much for making time out of your travel schedule, after all, for joining us as well.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'd like to begin to sort of frame this discussion with that of personal stories. Those always hold the greatest power. Theresa, I might begin with you. Growing up in northern Idaho, did you ever expect that you'd be confronted with a challenge that involved the murder of a loved one, a family member?
Of course not, but I don't think that anyone would.
Give us a sense, if you would, of your life experience prior to this. Growing up, what led you to this part of the country and your career. Just give us a sense of who you are.
I grew up in north central Idaho in a town called Orofino in the Clearwater Valley. It's actually situated on the Nez Perce Reservation, and I grew up there with my family. I graduated from Orofino High School. I went to college at Linfield College in McMinnville, Oregon, just south of Portland, Oregon. I met my husband there. I moved to Seattle and I went to the University of Washington for medical technology. So I worked as a medical technologist in the laboratory for multi-care health systems at Tacoma General Hospital in the oncology clinic, and also at Gig Harbor Medical Park. I've also worked for Swedish Hill with LabCorp and Dynacare in their microbiology department.
Now, when you met your husband, you had a shift in terms of your faith life. Can you describe that a little bit, and about the larger family that you were integrated into?
I met my husband in college. We were in chemistry class together, and we both were math minors with pre-med classes, so we had all of our classes together. And my husband was born in a refugee camp in Peshawar, Pakistan. He and his family immigrated to Portland, Oregon in the 1980s. My husband is the youngest of 6, and they've just grown up in Portland, Oregon.
It has to be difficult to revisit the crime in any sense of what occurred, but if you would, can you walk us through what happened?
Well, on February 10th, 2016, my father-in-law, Jamil Kamawell, may he rest in peace and may God forgive his sins, he was murdered while he was praying in his front yard in the middle of the day. While he was prostrating with his head on the ground, a man hit him over the head multiple times with a shovel. My mother-in-law found his body, and then my brother-in-law, sister-in-law's teenage nieces and nephews came out and saw his body. They tried to resuscitate him, but they were unable to, and the medics pronounced him dead at the scene.
Now, there was this person that was the perpetrator of that crime. He was not someone that just happened to be walking by. I think he had been hired to do some actual work on your father-in-law's property, correct?
Yes, my father-in-law had hired him from Crecelius to help clean up around some construction they were doing on a house.
Mm-hmm.
So he'd met him once before and had interviewed him.
Now, it's the terminology, but he was ultimately not convicted of a hate crime, but it seemed like there was very little doubt that that was the motivating factor behind the assault. Could you tell us a little bit about how that played out?
My family was offered the option of accepting a plea bargain, which included the charge of manslaughter,
Mm-hmm.
or pursuing a trial and asking for a crime of murder and a harsher sentence. And when we asked the prosecutor why it wasn't being pursued as a hate crime, because it wasn't at all,
Right.
the prosecutor said, well, he grew up in Southern California, which is very diverse, and his sister has been cooperative with us, and that was taken as evidence that it wasn't a hate crime, even though my father-in-law was in the middle of prayer when he was murdered.
Theresa, I think one of the great tragedies when someone either becomes a victim of a hate crime or even survives one is that that's how they're identified from that point on. From the little bit I've read, your father-in-law was so much more than that and had so many gifts that he sought to offer to other people. If you can tell us a little bit more about what it was that he was doing and some of his passions in life.
In 2001, Jamil established a charity organization called Kama Relief Corporation, which has helped thousands of children, disabled people, widows, and generally poverty-stricken families. They've provided wells for clean drinking water, canals for irrigation, new community centers that house schools for some of the most undereducated populations in the world. They've provided food rations and basic health care, and this is in one of the poorest districts in Afghanistan, the Kama district.
What was beyond the crime itself, what was your biggest disappointment in the days and weeks afterward, and what was the biggest surprise that you experienced in terms of unexpected support?
I think it not being mentioned in the media at all, because it was a white man who killed my father-in-law.
Mm-hmm.
I think our national and local media have a certain narrative that they always display, and when something doesn't fit that, then it doesn't reach the level where they're going to broadcast it. So I thought it was newsworthy, and I thought other people would also be concerned about it. So I was surprised that not more people were talking about it and that not a lot of people had even heard about it.
What was the biggest surprise in terms of unexpected support that you encountered after that?
Well, we had, though my in-laws are Afghan, and the way that Afghans grieve is everyone comes over to the house. So the next 3 days we had hundreds of people coming and grieving and crying and supporting each other. And the funeral in the mosque in Masjid As-Sabr, the mosque in Portland, was completely full. People were praying outside because they couldn't fit into the mosque. And then again, there was another funeral in Afghanistan. My father-in-law wanted to be buried there. There were thousands of people at his funeral. So my father-in-law and his work has affected thousands of people here and in Afghanistan.
Well, we're going to come back to your story and where that's led, but I'd like to turn to Rais. And Rais, thanks again for joining us. Give us a sense, if you would, as a foundation of your life path, how it led from Bangladesh, and having been a pilot myself, we enjoyed trading some stories, how it ended up leading from Bangladesh to this country.
Well, I was born in the capital city of Bangladesh, Dhaka, and I attended a military boarding school, one of the best schools in the country, and had a dream to be an Air Force pilot. So after graduating from the military school, I prepared myself very well, and I was selected to go to the Air Force Academy to fulfill my childhood dream. But after graduating as a pilot officer, I did not feel my destiny was there. So when I got a chance to come to the United States for additional higher education, I took it. So temporarily, I left my home, my family, and my career to fulfill my academic pursuits while also hoping to experience the American dream.
Mm-hmm.
And that brought me to U.S. I lived in New York City for a few years, and then moved to Dallas a few months before 9/11.
And in that year, 2001, your life changed in a direction you could never anticipate, and certainly one that led you to be tenuously hanging on to life. Can you describe for us what occurred?
Sure. It was September 21st, 2001, 10 days after 9/11 terrorist attacks. I just moved from New York to Dallas to stay with a friend and to also to open a gas station business with him.
Mm-hmm.
So on the day 21st September, I was working in the gas station when it was raining since morning. Business was pretty slow. Around 12:30 p.m., a customer walked in wearing a bandana, sunglasses, baseball cap, and holding a sort of double-barrel shotgun. From my previous robbery experience, I thought it would be another robbery. So I placed all the cash on the counter, and I offered him the money, and I begged him not to shoot me. But he was not looking at the money, though. His eyes were fixed at me, and then he mumbled a question, "Where are you from?" And I was confused that, if he's here to rob me, take the money and just leave quickly. And I was panicked. I said, "Excuse me?" And I could not finish my sentence. He pulled the trigger from point blank range.
Mm.
And I felt it first, like a million bees were stinging my face. And then I heard the sound, the big explosion. And I could not actually believe that he shot me. I looked down to the floor and saw blood pouring like an open faucet from the right side of my head. And frantically, I placed both hands on my head, thinking I had to keep my brain from spilling out.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember screaming, "Mom," at the top of my voice. And then noticed the gunman is still standing there with the pointing gun at my face. And I thought if I did not appear to be dead, he would shoot me again.
Mm-hmm.
So I fell to the floor, and he finally left. That was the day when my American dream turned into an American nightmare.
So you were at the service station, you'd been shot. What was the path like from the actual shooting to the ultimate recovery then?
As a result of the shooting, I lost vision in one eye.
Mm-hmm.
The right side of my face and skull was and remains peppered with more than 3 dozen bullet fragments. I lost my job, my home, my sense of security, and my fiancé, but gained more than $60,000 in medical bills. And I reached out to Red Cross for help, but finally they told me I was qualified only for 1 week's worth of groceries. And when my father heard what happened to me, he suffered a stroke, but thankfully he survived. When my attacker, Mark Sturman, was arrested, he voluntarily told the news media that what he had done, most Americans wanted to do, they just didn't have the guts. And he claimed he was a true American, a patriot. And he blamed me and my kind for 9/11, and he said America was no place for Muslims.
And we should clarify that you were not the only victim of this man. There were other people that he shot as well, correct?
Right. He shot and killed Mr. Hassan on September 15th, which was not too far from our gas station.
Hmm.
And he shot me on 21st September, and then he killed Mr. Patel from India on October the 4th. So he killed 2, and he almost killed myself.
What transpired after that to your assailant? Because I think that's where we really see this path of transcendence, if you will.
Right. Well, on my way to the hospital, which I thought was my deathbed, I promised to God that if you give me a chance to live, I would do good things with my life. I would dedicate my life for others, especially for the needy, poor, and vulnerable. And when Mark Twain was given death sentence in 2002, the next several years I went through a healing process where I grew mentally, psychologically, and also physically. And I focused on rebuilding my life in my adopted country. And I started going to school, a waiting table for $2.13 per hour, learned to talk Texan. And at the same time, a lot of Americans came forward who helped me a lot to rebuild my life. And finally, in 2009, I was able to go for a Muslim religious pilgrimage to Mecca with my mother. And I deeply realized in Mecca that hate and revenge may bring temporary satisfaction, but it does not bring any solution or peace to any situation. It only causes more suffering and it caused more violence. And I deeply thought about my shooter, Mark Twain, sitting on death row waiting to die. And I realized that by killing him, we would simply lose another human life without dealing with the root cause. Instead of hating him, I began to see him as a human being like me. I also started seeing him as a victim too. And I deeply realized that if he was given a second chance, he might be able to become a better human being and could contribute to society in a positive way. And my upbringing and my faith and all the powerful stories of mercy and forgiveness that I learned gave me the courage and strength not only to forgive my attacker, but also to run a campaign to try to save the man's life who tried to end mine. And with the help of Amnesty International, Muslim Legal Fund of America, with the help of Dr. Rick Halperin from SMU, and Hadi Jawad, these are very good friends of mine in Dallas, Texas, who came forward, and helped me to launch the campaign to save the life of my attacker from death row.
And there's a very powerful piece of video when you actually ended up meeting with your assailant. And I think we can go to that right now and see that powerful moment.
For this man to forgive me, which I've done the unforgivable, for him to come forward the way he did, it speaks volume. It speaks volume for the human race.
Rais, we're going to come back more to your story as we talk about how this fits in the larger scheme of the topic we're talking about. Arjun, you've taken a position of leadership both in terms of documenting experiences such as those of Rais and of Theresa and her family, and also of working to change the conditions, the beliefs that lead to these sorts of actions. But before we get into that, as a Sikh, you've undoubtedly experienced, perhaps at a lower level, some of these same aggressions. Can you experience, or can you share some of your experiences with that?
Sure. I want to start by thanking Rais and Theresa for sharing their stories. They are brave, they are courageous, and they are American heroes. So thank you for being here, and thank you for being living portraits of what we can all really aspire to be. So I'm a Sikh American. I can be readily identified by my articles of faith, which include my long hair, which I cover with a turban, and a beard. Sikh Americans are acutely vulnerable to bullying, profiling, and hate violence. One of the very first hate crimes committed after 9/11 was a hate crime against a Sikh American, Balbir Singh Sodhi, who was murdered outside his gas station in Mesa, Arizona, just days after 9/11. And as a Sikh American, I too have experienced incidents of hate and police profiling. I was bullied when I was young. I've been arbitrarily stopped by police. I have been attacked before. In working on my book, American Hate Survivors Speak Out, which is a collection of testimonials of people targeted by hate violence in the run-up to the 2016 election and under the Trump administration, I was nearly driven off the road in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I was intentionally misdirected on the campus of American University. In Whitefish, Montana, a cashier at a grocery store didn't want to sell me groceries because she didn't like the way I looked.
You mentioned your book, American Hate. It's both very readable, but it's also very troubling. Can you put in perspective for us how the stories of Theresa and of Rais help with the stories that are in your book and that you've heard beyond that? Paint a picture of what is behind these sort of acts, this sort of othering of people.
So Rais and Theresa's story aren't in the book per se, but there are similarities to their experiences that are in the book. They are living examples of what some call restorative justice and reconciliation. As I traveled the country, I found lots of pain. I found lots of grief. But I also found that survivors like Theresa, like Rais, are organizing, building a better life for themselves and better lives for their communities. And that's a beautiful thing to see. In terms of the origination of hate and where it comes from, that's a lengthier and longer discussion. I say on page 2 of the book, the United States was built on a hate crime, the decimation and destruction of Native communities, and was furthered on additional hate crimes, including slavery and Jim Crow. So I think we do need to have deeper conversations about our ugly history of anti-Black racism, anti-Native sentiment, because I think a lot of what we experience today is an outgrowth of that history. But I think it's still nevertheless fair to say that the policies and rhetoric of Donald Trump have emboldened hate violence across this country. And if you meet with survivors and you talk to impacted communities, that is what they overwhelmingly believe, which is again why I decided to travel the country and compile these stories in my book, American Hate: Survivors Speak Out.
So what response would each of you say would be most effective in perhaps turning around the cycle of hate and violence? And is a single response suitable for all situations?
So there's no elixir, and as you rightly pointed out, in responding to hate crimes and hate incidents generally, we have to center survivors and impacted communities. For me, the most urgent need is something that Rais described. After he was the target of a hate crime, look at how much he lost. Look how little support he had. And that's what I found even in 2018. There are survivors of hate violence across this country who don't have access to health care, whose employers don't understand, who need access to legal counsel, who suffer from PTSD. So I think the most urgent need is to make sure that we are supporting survivors and getting them the resources they need.
Theresa, what's your perspective?
I started working for the Muslim Association of Puget Sound with Anila Afzali in the American Muslim Empowerment Network, and our main goal is combating the hate that is behind Islamophobia and all other acts of injustice. And we approach it by educating people about Islam, organizing events where people can come to our mosque and meet a Muslim and ask them the questions they want to ask. Because American Muslims make up 1% of the population, and a lot of the fear comes from not having met a Muslim or not realizing the person was Muslim. Not all American Muslim women wear a scarf. It's not required part of Islamic dress. And so you might have met a Muslim and not have realized it. So MAPS Amen and my mosque in general organize a lot of events where we invite the public in. We do tours of the mosque. We do quarterly open houses. That's part of what we do. And another aspect is engaging the community, being a part of interfaith coalitions that work for fighting for social justice around the state and in Seattle. We also communicate with our elected representatives to be a voice for the community so they know which issues are impacting us as citizens. And then thirdly, we also empower other American Muslims and non-Muslims by holding training sessions on how to be an activist, how to be an ally. And I can go into more detail about that later.
Rais, what's your perspective?
Well, this is a twofold answer. First of all is, as Arjun mentioned, that we need to provide sufficient support to the victims. I was discharged from the hospital next day. It was a private and expensive hospital, and I was discharged next day morning, and I was told to arrange follow-up medical treatments at my own. And I could not believe that I was shot in the face a day before, and I'm discharged next day. And I felt terrible that day. I mean, it was the second part of my American nightmare, getting discharged from the hospital. I could not believe. We need to find ways to support the victims. At the same time, we need to also find ways to educate each other, find ways to make more human connections. Because education is more important, what is happening right now in our country and also what happened in the past. As Arjun talked about, that we need to acknowledge what happened in the past, all the wrong, all the cruel injustice, all the things was done to the Native Americans. All the cruel, all the unjust, cruel, inhuman behavior was wrong was done to the African Americans and all the other groups. We need to acknowledge that it was wrong, and we need to find ways to move forward as one united, peaceful nation.
As you might suspect, there is so much more we could go into, and in fact, we are going to go into. This is going to be followed up by a second set of conversations with each of us, and we hope you'll join us for that next week on Challenge 2.0. Thank you.